Hey, so in this video lecture, I'm going to talk to you guys about Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind. We're reading just an excerpt from it for this class. This starts on 2737. So, Ngugi is one of the most important post-colonial thinkers. He is a Kenyan novelist and post-colonial theorist, and a lot of his work, especially his most famous book, his most famous theory book anyway, Decolonizing the Mind, is about the role of language in creating colonial ideology. So what this means essentially is, or for Ngugi, what the purpose of language is in a colony is to reshape the way that people understand themselves, their relationship to their nation, their relationship to the empire, and their relationship to the material conditions of production. And we get this especially in section 5. This is on 2740. So we have initially this sort of introduction, this introductory section for the first few pages, which is section 3, where Ngugi is talking about his educational history and how the imposition of the English language, as opposed to his own native language, Gikuyu, through education, this sort of reshaped the way that these young Kenyans understood their connections to their community, and language became a question of almost physical survival. But it's really, like, we get the culmination of this, we get this sort of ultimate, sort of main point of Ngugi, of his Decolonizing the Mind, here in section 5. So he says here, the real aim of colonialism was to control the people's wealth, what they produced, how they produced it, and how it was distributed. To control, in other words, the entire realm of the language of real life. Colonialism imposed its control of the social production of wealth through military conquest and subsequent political dictatorship. But its most important area of domination was the mental universe of the colonized. The control through culture of how people perceived themselves and their relationship to the world. Economic and political control can never be complete or effective without mental control. To control a people's culture is to control their tools of self-definition in relationship to others. Now, this is a crucial passage because this is one of the central cruxes of post-colonial theory. This idea that through the imposition of language, the imposition of culture, the imposition of literature, the colonizer reshapes the psychology, reshapes the subjectivity, reshapes the mind of the colonized. So, and we see this in Ngugi's story about his early education. What we have in this story is the replacement of Kenyan folk stories, Kenyan folk wisdom, which centers on cooperation, it centers on working with the community, it centers on cleverness, it centers on all of these things, being opposed to things like individualism, violence, brutality, the might makes right kind of ideology. This whole set of folklore, this whole set of stories, cultural norms, and so on and so on, gets replaced when Ngugi goes to a colonial school, because what's imposed on these students is British language, British literature, the classics, so Greek and Roman literature, Greek and Latin languages, in addition to English, although Ngugi doesn't talk much about that in this particular section, um, the way that education was structured in colonial Africa was very, very heavy um, with Greek and Roman texts, and Latin was very common in the education of young Africans. Greek was somewhat less common, but this was all about, like, the education system in colonial Africa, either in British or French colonial Africa, was set up to basically to teach through sets of cultures and through imposing cultures that African culture, African civilization was inferior to European tradition, culture, civilization, and so on and so on. And so you learned Shakespeare, you learned Dickens, you learned Aeschylus, you learned Sophocles, you learned Cicero, you learned Horace, you learned Virgil, or if you were French, you learned Rancière and Corneille, and all these people. And the idea ultimately was a sort of Anglicization of Africa. The idea was that you would stamp out African culture, you would erase it from the cultural memory of these different nations, these different African nations, and you would replace it with English. You would replace it with British culture, British education, British literature, and classic European literature that is taken as the basis for British culture, European culture, and so on and so on. And so what Ngugi is pointing out here, and this is again a major plank in post-colonial theory, is the way in which language and literature and culture gets imposed on a colony or a conquered area as a means of essentially brainwashing an entire people to the point where their culture will no longer exist. Now this is actually extremely hard to do. Other than sort of straight up genocide, it's actually very difficult to destroy a culture because cultures tend to have a way of, or tend to have ways of transmitting themselves, generally through different forms of resistance, through folk stories, folk songs, tales, and things like this. They get passed down in the home, sort of under the radar of official scrutiny. So it's very, very hard to actually destroy a culture unless you kill all of the people. But what colonization did, which was a significant problem for Ngugi and other post-colonial theorists, is that it compromises the legitimacy and it compromises the ability of young Africans to have pride in their own cultures. So while Gikuyu language and Kiswahili and other African languages, African stories, African performance traditions, and so on aren't wiped out, they're significantly eroded. And they are eroded partially through this sort of official banning of certain religious practices, official banning of languages and things like this, official persecutions, but they're also compromised by the encounter with British literature and culture. So when Alan Paton and H. Rider Haggard and Shakespeare and T.S. Eliot and so on become part of the education, it displaces African folk stories, it displaces traditional songs, traditional ceremonies, traditional ways of looking at the world. All of this stuff gets displaced by the presence of British literature. And when the school system is telling you British literature is legitimate literature, this is actually worth reading and studying and knowing, everything that you have learned in your own language and from your own culture is illegitimate, is barbaric, is savage, is primitive, is worthless, whatever it is, it becomes very difficult for children to take pride in their own culture when every component of their culture is denigrated in a systematic way through education. And so what Ngugi proposes, and the reason that he goes back to writing in Gikuyu, he proposes that Africans need to return to their pre-colonial culture, or they need to try and strengthen their pre-colonial cultures and excise as much of the British influence as possible in order to re-establish their authentic African identities and in order to create the possibility of pride in an African identity. Now that's a really sort of overly simplified view of Ngugi's position, because he does realize and he does sort of acknowledge that you can never go back to before the colonial encounter. So he knows that even if he writes and thinks in Gikuyu, he can never sort of go back and not be influenced by his British education. But what he wants to do, what he proposes, as opposed to someone like Homi Bhabha, who's very much about cultural hybridity, Ngugi is pushing for a sort of cultural reclamation in which African language, African literature, and African ways of thinking and looking at the world become valued in themselves, rather than being valued for what they can either contribute to European civilization or British civilization, or being looked at as a sort of offshoot, a sort of subset of British or European literature and culture.